Final Fantasy accidentally built one of gaming's most punishing optional boss libraries. Penance hid behind hours of endgame preparation. Yezmat regenerated health faster than most parties could deal damage. The series' founding superboss became a legend largely because it stayed hidden, turning Rarity into a reputation no stat sheet could fully justify. That's why today I'm ranking the single hardest boss from every mainline Final Fantasy game and explaining what made each one so brutal. Starting with the legend, plenty of players finished without ever triggering it. Final Fantasy Warmech. The scariest boss in the original Final Fantasy is one that many players never encountered. There I said it. Warmech lurks inside the Flying Fortress, the game's final dungeon, as a random encounter with no story trigger forcing it onto your screen. Players who moved through that dungeon at a normal pace could roll credits without ever seeing it spawn. Decades of retrospectives crown it the hardest optional fight in the game, and a lot of that praise comes from people who read about it rather than fought it. Nothing in the game's design confirms this outright, but the pattern holds. With no online guides in 1987 and a spawn rate low enough to skip whole playthroughs, the mystery around Warmech outgrew its stat sheet. A kid who spent a summer grinding through that fortress and never triggered the fight walked away convinced the game hid a secret it never showed him. That gap between sightings and stories is the whole legend, but Rarity is a passive kind of cruelty. The next game on this ranking replaced random invisibility with something more deliberate, a final boss so far beyond the rest of the game that the difficulty curve turns into a cliff. The Emperor. Final Fantasy II is often remembered for putting its hardest boss at the end of the mandatory path, an outlier in a franchise that often hid its toughest challenges in optional rooms. The Emperor is often cited as the game's hardest fight, though some players point to Astaroth as the real wall. Most entries reserve that spot for optional superbosses. Here the final boss is also widely considered the game's hardest fight, standing between the player and the credits. The difficulty comes loaded with a structural trap. Stats build through use. Swing a sword and strength climbs, take damage and HP grows, cast a spell and magic rises. Skip stat training and the Emperor dismantles the party in 3 turns. Balanced growth and the fight barely registers. The system creates uneven experiences. The Emperor becomes the final exam with no makeup test. Walk in unprepared and the fight ends the run. Warmech hid difficulty behind a 1 in 64 chance and a specific stretch of the floating castle. The Emperor waits at the only exit, a mandatory gauntlet with no optional chamber beyond it. 2 games in, and the series has shown 2 different answers to the same question. The third doubles down on the second, but adds a wrinkle. A boss so cosmically scaled, the fight feels less like a test and more like a statement. Cloud of Darkness. Cloud of Darkness has been a fixture in franchise-wide hardest boss discussions for years, making it one of the oldest difficulty benchmarks still named in modern retrospectives. That longevity matters. Many early-era Final Fantasy bosses fade from the conversation once the next game arrives. Cloud of Darkness stayed. The fight closes. Final Fantasy III as the required final boss, continuing the pattern from the first 3 games. Community lists frequently point to this fight when discussing Final Fantasy III difficulty, and in the original NES version, the superboss tradition had not yet arrived. Finishing the game means fighting Cloud of Darkness. Part of that reputation comes from timing. The 2006 DS remake was Final Fantasy III's first official Western release. So many Western players met Cloud of Darkness late, arriving with a catalog of later Final Fantasy games for context. The design reads as punishing against that backdrop, a contrast the original Japanese audience did not encounter in the same way. The consistency stands out most. In many retrospectives, the difficulty is seen as holding up across console generations, remakes, and shifting player standards. Cloud of Darkness outlasted its own era and stayed in the conversation when many other early bosses largely faded from franchise memory. 3 games where the final boss is frequently cited as the hardest challenge. In the original releases, the optional challenge tier had not yet arrived. The 4th game on this ranking is where the cracks start to show and where the evidence itself becomes part of the story. The Proud Claude. Somebody on the writing team for this ranking put a Final Fantasy VII boss into a Final Fantasy IV slot, and the mistake is more interesting than the fight itself. The Proud Claude belongs to a fight against a giant mech piloted by a Shinra executive, decades of franchise trivia away from anything on the moon. Final Fantasy IV fans will likely catch that instantly, and they should. Here's what actually earns this slot. Final Fantasy IV's most punishing challenges lie largely outside the main quest. Later versions added the Lunar Ruins, a bonus dungeon stacked with fights that rival or surpass anything Cecil faces in the main story. Community rankings of the game's toughest encounters frequently point toward this post-game tower, often placing it above the story route. That's the real shift happening here. The first 3 games in this ranking kept their nastiest fights on the road you had to walk anyway. Final Fantasy IV is the first in this ranking to place its very hardest fight inside an optional post-game dungeon, one you only enter after the credits already rolled once, and that room is where players actually lose weekends. A kid who beat Zeromus and put the cartridge down never met the thing waiting in the ruins. A kid who kept going traded hours more for a fight the story never once asked for. The specific name attached to this slot is almost certainly a production slip borrowed from a much later game by mistake. The pattern underneath it isn't a mistake at all. Final Fantasy IV marks the point in the ranking where the hardest challenge moves out of the main story and builds itself a separate address. That address doesn't have a name yet. It's about to get one, and a reputation that will outlive the game that built it. Final Fantasy V, Omega. Omega can be read as the moment the series began building its hardest challenges on purpose rather than stumbling into them. Final Fantasy IV had put the optional chamber in the building, a sealed room where punishment lived apart from the main story, but whatever lived inside that room still felt like something the designers arrived at sideways. Omega reads as though it came with a different mandate: be the hardest encounter in the game, exist entirely outside the main story's concerns, hide behind a barrier the main story never acknowledges, and wait there for whoever was stubborn enough to come looking. The game hid that barrier well enough that many players completed Final Fantasy V without ever encountering the fight. The player who found it recognized what it was, and started committing grinding hours to survive. The opening seconds paid a cost the narrative never required and never rewarded in any way the credits would reflect. The main story's demands ended at the final dungeon. Omega issued a separate invoice, and the only return on it was the private knowledge that you could pay it. That transaction, time spent on a challenge the story had zero interest in validating, would become one of the defining templates for optional superboss design across the next decade of the series. The community debate that followed has been running for decades. 30 years in, still no consensus, much like several major geopolitical disputes. Omega pairs with Shinryu as the game's 2 canonical optional superbosses, and the argument over which one is actually harder sits unresolved across the same forum threads where it started. Omega is frequently cited alongside Shinryu in franchise-wide hardest boss discussions, and in many of those lists Omega edges ahead. The rivalry itself is worth stopping on. Final Fantasy V had generated enough optional punishment that fans built an internal ranking system, and the argument over that ranking became a fixture of the community. That is a design milestone the earlier games had not produced in quite the same way. The second track in Omega's legacy is harder to measure, but more interesting. Follow fan discussion long enough and a consistent pattern surfaces, players cite its machine identity right alongside the difficulty numbers. The rotating chassis against a game built on crystal lore and job systems. Something from outside the world's design logic, planted inside it as if specifically to end you. Nothing in canon establishes this directly, but the pattern is strong enough to take seriously as a reading. Omega may be the first boss in the series where the aesthetic of the superboss fused with the mechanical difficulty so completely that the two became a single object. The look was the threat. Follow that idea forward, and the major superboss designs in every subsequent entry start reading as responses to a question Omega first posed, whether the designers were consciously answering it or not, which makes the hidden barrier detail land differently in retrospect. The developers built the gate, built what was behind it, and pointed the narrative somewhere else entirely. The player who found it anyway, who stayed and cleared it, finished a challenge the story had zero interest in, and received zero acknowledgement for completing. The reward was purely internal. That mechanic, stopping being an option at the exact moment the design gets hardest, would become a defining thread the tradition carried forward. Final Fantasy IV, put the room in the building. Omega moved in permanently. The next entry took that blueprint, filled the same room with multiple contenders, and handed the keys to a community where the argument over which one was harder had already begun. Kaiser Dragon. Final Fantasy VI has an argument brewing in its optional basement, one the fanbase has never fully settled. Ask 10 players which super boss earns the crown, and you'll get a handful of different answers, none of them soft. Kaiser Dragon shows up constantly in modern challenge runs, buried behind advanced bonus content that only arrived with the Game Boy Advance release. It regenerates, it punishes greed, and it's one of the most common names when players hash out the game's toughest optional fight. Plenty of veterans point somewhere else entirely, naming Ultima Weapon as the fight that actually broke their save file. That's what separates this slot from Final Fantasy V, where Omega and Shinryu both occupied the optional tier, but the argument over which was harder had cleaner lines. Kaiser Dragon shares the room. The rankings that include it also include Ultima Weapon in the same breath, sometimes ranking one above the other, sometimes just listing both and letting the reader pick a side. The knockout argument that ends the debate still hasn't shown up. That messiness is the interesting part. Maybe a game only generates this kind of split when its optional content runs deep enough to support two legitimate nightmares instead of one. Somewhere in a save file from 2006, a player is still grinding levels against a dragon that heals faster than they can chip away at it, watching the clock and wondering if the run was worth it. The optional tier in the previous game already had two monsters to argue over, and Final Fantasy VI made the argument harder to settle. When a game has enough optional monsters to start an argument, the next step is a single boss so infamous that the argument ends. The 7th game on this ranking produced a fight that players know by reputation, even when they never dared to attempt it: Emerald Weapon. Emerald Weapon is the boss many players decided not to fight after hearing what their friends went through. One of two optional super weapons in Final Fantasy VII, Emerald sits completely outside the story's required path in the endgame ocean. You can roll credits without knowing it exists. The fight became a benchmark anyway, one of those names that circulated through forums and school cafeterias as shorthand for impossible optional content. Many players who never unlocked the submarine still knew the name. That reach turned Emerald Weapon into something closer to folklore than a boss encounter. The difficulty is widely acknowledged across fan rankings and community polls. Emerald Weapon regularly places among the hardest fights in the entire franchise, not just its own game. The encounter demands specific materia setups, hours of endgame preparation, and a tolerance for fights that can run 20 minutes before a single mistake can unravel the attempt. The time investment alone kept many players from attempting it. Walking away felt easier than grinding for another evening against a boss whose eyes kept coming back at full strength. The lingering debate over whether Emerald Weapon or Ruby Weapon deserves the harder slot arguably cements Emerald's status. A boss famous enough to split the fanbase over which version of Brutal is worse may have already won the reputation war. The argument itself is the evidence. Ruby Weapon earned its own following, but Emerald became a common answer when someone outside the community asked which Final Fantasy boss breaks players. That fame turned the fight into a landmark you could admire from a distance, the way certain mountains get known for the people who turned back halfway up. Fame is one kind of intimidation. The next game on this ranking took the same super boss template and stripped away the friendly parts of the game around it, building a fight that regularly sent players hunting for a guide before the first move: Omega Weapon. Omega Weapon is a fight where plenty of players walked into the chamber, looked at their junction setup, and opened a guide in a separate window. This is Final Fantasy VIII's signature optional super boss, and one of the most recognizable super boss names in the series. The community groups it with Ultimecia when ranking the game's toughest encounters, but Omega Weapon holds the optional boss consensus. In retrospect, the fight reads as a marker for a specific kind of difficulty, where trying without outside help felt less like bravery and more like a wasted afternoon. The reputation makes sense once you map the actual requirement. Omega Weapon demanded mastery of Final Fantasy VIII's junction system, a divisive mechanic for binding magic to stats that the game explained in tutorials many players skipped or struggled to apply. Players who understood the system could break the entire game in half before the second disc. Players who treated it like a standard RPG equipment menu walked into Omega Weapon with the statistical equivalent of a butter knife. The difficulty owed at least as much to what the game withheld as to the boss's own damage output. Final Fantasy VIII buried its strongest builds behind a mechanic many players struggled to decode, so Omega Weapon effectively became the encounter that showed who had cracked the homework and who had been guessing since the tutorial. What made Omega Weapon different? The bar rose from raw persistence to hidden expertise. Emerald Weapon rewarded patience and material farming. Omega Weapon effectively required the player to have cracked the game's own internal logic, then showed up to the fight with the answer key in hand. The cost played out exactly the way it always does. The player who walked away and the one who stayed long enough that quitting would hurt more than another 10 failed attempts. A fight that demands hidden expertise tends to spark whispers that it might be the hardest in the series. The 9th game on this ranking produced exactly that whisper, and it has echoed through the community ever since. Final Fantasy IX, Ozma. Ask Final Fantasy players which boss scares them most, and plenty will point to a translucent purple orb that never appears in the story of Final Fantasy IX. That's Ozma. You find it at Chocobo's Air Garden, an optional floating side area, deeply unnecessary, in the best way, reached by Golden Chocobo, where the encounter waits for players who complete the hot and cold side quest. The stats back up the reputation. Ozma casts Curse, which can instantly kill or zombify a party member in one move, and follows it with Meteor for damage numbers that dwarf anything the story bosses throw at you. Its counterattacks punish a careless turn immediately, and its defensive stats shrug off attacks that would one-shot most story bosses in the game. Players spend significant time assembling specific gear combinations just to survive the opening exchange, let alone win the fight. Omega Weapon asked players to master hidden mechanics buried inside one-game systems. Ozma takes that same demand and strips the game's name off it entirely, because Ozma is one of the fights people most often cite when arguing about the single hardest boss in Final Fantasy history. Some players argue a different superboss demands sharper reflexes, but even they tend to put Ozma in the conversation, which says something about how high the bar sits. That alignment likely comes from years of separate players on separate forums in separate eras of the fandom, independently arriving at the same conclusion. When that many independent conclusions line up over that long a stretch, it earns the weight of a series-wide verdict. Consider the cost behind that verdict. Someone grinds a character to level 99, farms specific accessories for hours, memorizes exact turn patterns, and still loses to a single unlucky curse roll. That's the tax Ozma charges. A running total of hours, paid in full only when every roll lands right at once. Reputation is one way to top the series. Raw numbers are another. The next game on this ranking answered the difficulty question with a figure that turned the fight into an act of pure attrition. Final Fantasy X, Penance. 12 million hit points. That is the number attached to Penance, the optional superboss buried in Final Fantasy X's endgame, and it turns every previous entry on this list into a rounding error by sheer scale alone. Ozma earned its reputation because surviving long enough to learn its patterns was brutally difficult. Penance hands you the math up front and dares you to do something about it. The fear arrives through transparency, seeing exactly how much punishment waits ahead and choosing to walk into it anyway. The fight splits into two forms, both built around arms that regenerate mid-battle no matter how much damage you pour into them. Destroy one limb and another grows back after only a few turns. Penance absorbs entire elements outright, so the same spells that carried you through Spyra's story do nothing here. Sometimes worse than nothing, actively healing the target you are trying to kill. Its attacks hit hard enough to erase characters who are not specifically built to survive them, and the fight routinely runs long enough that a single missed heal near the end can undo 40 minutes of careful play in one devastating turn. Community rankings rarely agree on much across so many games and decades of debate. They come closer to agreeing on this. Ask players who have cleared Final Fantasy X's endgame which boss earns the title of hardest, and Penance is the answer you will hear more often than not, close enough to consensus that ranking articles rarely bother arguing otherwise. The 12 million figure and the regenerating arms suggest a deliberate design choice, one that shifts the fight toward endurance rather than reflexes. This fight tests patience over reflex, stacking enough hit points onto one target that the real threat becomes the clock itself, the creature secondary to the endurance trial. Somewhere behind that number is a player who spent an entire evening chipping away at a health bar that barely moved, watching the arms grow back one more time, and closing the game without a single item to show for the hours invested. 12 million feels like the ceiling right up until a later entry blows past it entirely. The next boss on this list turns a raw hit point total into the whole fight, and the hours it demands from players become the story people actually remember. Final Fantasy XII, Yesmat. 50 million hit points. 50,112,254 to be exact, sitting on top of one dragon-shaped mistake that a lot of players hunted down anyway. Penance made 12 million look like a wall nobody could climb. Yasmat looked at that wall and quadrupled it, and that HP gap is what the boss remains most infamous for. The fight itself is barely a puzzle. Yasmat regenerates HP over time, so every pause, every bad turn, every party wipe costs progress already bled for. Players have logged runs of 6, 8, even 10 hours against this thing, chipping a health bar that fights back against being chipped. One mistimed reset and hours of work evaporate. The real threat is the slow math of exhaustion grinding against you hour after hour. This is where the series quietly changes what it's asking of the player. Earlier fights demanded reflexes or gear checks. Yasmat demands you sit in a chair for an entire evening and keep going anyway. The same way an earlier legendary fight demanded almost nobody find it at all. The person who quits at hour 6 loses nothing mechanically and everything emotionally, because quitting after that much time invested feels like defeat before the bar hits 0. The anecdotes bear this out. In many player accounts, the strategy is rarely what stands out most. Players often recount the hours spent, the downtime, and how many sittings it took. That's a boss remembered as a schedule, the hours logged mattering more than any tactic used against it. An enormous HP bar is one way to weaponize time. The next fight on this ranking weaponized something else entirely. Long Gui, a snail can outrun this thing, and that is the entire point. Long Gui plants itself on its shell, stacking spells faster than most parties can peel them off, daring you to outthink a fight that never has to move to win. Long Gui lives outside Final Fantasy XIII's story entirely, tucked into post-game hunts many players never opened. Community rankings often place Long Gui among the very toughest optional fights, alongside Vercingetorix at the peak of the Arshilt steppe hunts. Barthandelus, the story boss players remember arguing about, is widely remembered as one of the campaign's most frustrating gauntlets. Some fans point to Long Gui as the hardest optional boss, though others argue Vercingetorix takes that title. The gap between those two arguments is worth sitting in for a second. One is a fight everybody who finished the game experienced. The other is a fight only players willing to grind side content ever saw. The same quiet tax Yasmat charged, except now the currency is attention as much as ours. Final Fantasy XIII built its combat around paradigm shifts, swapping roles mid-fight on a clock that punishes hesitation. The record does not offer a definitive explanation for why many players came to regard Long Gui as the hardest optional boss, but the pattern is suggestive. A system built on rapid role swapping was always going to produce its hardest fight from the enemy that demanded the fastest reads instead of the biggest health bar total. That is the toll this ranking keeps collecting, the constant demand to prove you actually learned the system underneath it. Somewhere out there is a player who quit a Long Gui attempt at the 90-minute mark and never went back. Some optional bosses punish your reflexes. The next one on this ranking is famous for a different reason entirely. A fight so vast and so long that players joked the real enemy was the clock itself, and the sheer scale of the thing became the whole legend. Final Fantasy XV, Adamantoise. Adamantoise is an island, an actual island. The turtle sleeping in the distance that you realize, only after getting close, is breathing. The fight that follows is one of the more talked about optional battles, and a recurring observation about why it qualifies as hard lands in a remarkably specific place. It takes an extremely long time. For many players, that's the core of the critique. The creature carries so much health, spread across a body so vast that you can spend significant stretches of the battle just traveling between its weak points, that the endurance itself becomes the obstacle. Players who hit their personal time limit and quit mid-fight effectively lost before the mechanics had a real chance to matter. Walk far enough back on this ranking, and Long Gui, the Final Fantasy XIII superboss, fused that same stamina requirement with active mechanical pressure, where surviving meant constantly reading and adapting. Adamantoise compresses the formula differently. The mechanical ceiling sits lower, the time ceiling is extended further out. Patience, more than any particular skill, is the actual price of entry. The community humor around this fight is almost self-aware. How hard is Adamantoise? Have you got a few hours? There's a player who sat with this for an entire evening, grinding out a battle the main story never required against a creature the size of a small town, and the reward at the end was mostly the right to say they stayed. The cost the series keeps charging across this whole ranking, time and the slow recognition that stopping feels like failure even before you've technically lost, reaches something close to peak concentration here. Adamantoise distills the optional boss design philosophy down to its most honest form, a monument to commitment. Whatever cruelty lives inside that, the series spent 15 games keeping it behind a door the story never forced you to open. For 15 games, that door stayed optional. The question the series was always eventually going to answer was what happens when the designers pull the door from its frame entirely and move the punishment somewhere you cannot walk past. Final Fantasy XVI Ultima. For 13 games in this ranking, the hardest fight lived somewhere off to the side, a desert, a reef, a hidden island with a turtle the size of a city block. The side door became the pattern the series returned to, again and again. Ultima sits at the end of the required story path. Walk the main plot of Final Fantasy XVI, reach the final confrontation, and for many players, that is the game's hardest challenge. Much of the community's difficulty conversation lands here because there is no traditional optional superboss arena like the weapons or Ozma to pull the difficulty conversation away from the main story. Evidence for a distinct, universally agreed superboss in Final Fantasy XVI is thin. The thin evidence is the whole point. Follow the ladder this ranking climbed. Warmech waited on a single bridge, very few players stumbled onto it, and that rarity reads like the source of its legend. The Emperor and Cloud of Darkness stood at the required ending of their games before the dedicated optional superboss arena became a series tradition. Then the series spent entry after entry engineering a parallel punishment track, the weapons, the Ozma arena, the Celestial Dungeon, the Colosseum, and eventually an open-world turtle that could take hours to whittle down, which is technically optional. Adamantoise pushed that optional chamber to its absolute ceiling. Final Fantasy XVI dismantled the chamber and moved its contents back into the throne room. The player who stops before Ultima stops before the story ends. That is a different cost than logging off after a raid wipe on some optional reef, a different weight than grinding for hours against something the plot never asked you to find. The difficulty was always a toll. 13 games collected it at the side gate. Final Fantasy XVI built the punishment into the throne room and called it the ending. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.